The starship Endurance was burning when Commander Jake Morgan opened his eyes and saw the red emergency lights flashing above him. And he knew immediately that everything had gone wrong in the worst possible way. The attack had come without warning near the Korath Nebula, a place where human ships rarely traveled because it sat too close to Volanti territory. But Command had ordered them to investigate strange signals coming from an abandoned outpost. And now Jake understood that it had been a trap from the very beginning. Pulled himself up from the floor of the bridge and looked around at the chaos surrounding him, seeing sparks flying from broken consoles and hearing the groaning of metal as the ship twisted under the damage it had taken. And he counted 4 of his bridge crew still alive and moving while 2 others lay motionless near the weapons station. "Commander," called out his first officer, a young woman named Katie, who had blood running down the side of her face, but was still working frantically at her console. "We have 6 Volanti warships closing in on our position, and shields are completely gone." Jake grabbed the edge of his command chair and steadied himself as another explosion rocked the ship. And he looked at the view screen to see the enemy vessels moving closer like sharks that had smelled blood in the water, their elegant silver hulls gleaming against the darkness of space. "How many of our crew are still alive?" he asked, his voice calm despite the fear that gripped his heart. "Sensors show 112 life signs," Katie replied. "But that number is dropping every minute as fire spread through the lower decks." Jake closed his eyes for just a moment and made the decision that every commander dreads but must be prepared to make. Knowing that his own life meant nothing compared to the lives of the people who trusted him to lead them. "Order all hands to abandon ship," he commanded. "I want everyone in escape pods and heading away from the battle within the next 5 minutes." Katie stared at him with wide eyes. "Commander, what about you?" "Someone needs to stay behind and keep the weapons firing long enough for the pods to get clear," Jake answered. "And that someone is going to be me." The bridge crew began to protest, but Jake silenced them with a raised hand and a look that told them arguing would waste precious time. And one by one they made their way to the emergency exits while Katie lingered for just a moment longer. "It has been an honor serving with you, sir," she said quietly. "The honor was mine," Jake replied. "Now go and make sure everyone gets out safely." He watched her leave and then turned back to the weapons console, his fingers moving across the controls as he targeted the nearest Volanti ship and fired everything the Endurance had left. And he felt a grim satisfaction as he saw the enemy vessel shudder under the impact of his missiles for the next 10 minutes. Jake Morgan fought alone against impossible odds, dancing the dying Endurance through space while firing weapon after weapon at the enemy fleet. And he managed to destroy 3 Volanti cruisers before they finally disabled his guns completely. He watched on the sensors as the escape pods carrying his crew scattered in all directions, most of them reaching the safety of a nearby asteroid field where the Volanti would have difficulty following. And he allowed himself a small smile, knowing that at least some of his people would survive. The boarding alarms began to sound as Volanti soldiers cut through the hull of his ship. And Jake picked up a plasma rifle and made his way through the burning corridors to meet them, determined to take as many of the enemy with him as possible before the end came. He fought through 3 decks, using every piece of cover he could find and every trick he had learned in 15 years of military service. And the bodies of Volanti soldiers piled up behind him as he retreated deeper into the ship, but there were too many of them, and he was just one man. And eventually, a plasma blast caught him in the shoulder and sent him spinning to the floor where darkness claimed him, before he could raise his weapon again when Jake woke up. He found himself in chains aboard a ship that was clearly not human, and the walls around him glowed with soft blue light while strange symbols floated in the air like living things. And he knew immediately that he had been captured by the Velanthitwo guards stood watching him, their tall silver bodies motionless except for the slow blinking of their large, dark eyes. And they said nothing as Jake tested his restraints and found them impossible to break. His environmental suit was still sealed, which meant his helmet remained in place. And Jake was grateful for this small protection, as it meant the aliens could not see his face or read his expressions. The guards exchanged words in their musical language, and though Jake did not understand the sounds, he caught a tone of something that might have been wonder or perhaps fear. And he realized that human prisoners must be very rare indeed. Hours passed as Jake sat in his cell, and he used the time to assess his injuries and his situation, finding that his shoulder wound had been treated with some kind of alien medicine that had stopped the bleeding but left a dull ache that reminded him of how close he had come to death. Finally, the guards approached and released him from the wall, keeping his wrists bound as they led him through corridors of impossible beauty. And Jake found himself staring at architecture that seemed to grow rather than be built, with curves and angles that hurt his eyes if he looked at them too long. They brought him to a massive doorway that opened onto the largest room Jake had ever seen. A throne room that stretched so high he could barely see the ceiling. And at its center sat a figure that could only be the Volante Queen herself. She was beautiful in a way that was also terrifying, her silver skin flowing like liquid metal as she moved, her eyes burning with light that seemed to contain entire galaxies. And when she looked at Jake, he felt as though she was seeing not just his body, but his very soul. The guards forced him to his knees before her throne, and the queen rose from her seat and began to descend the steps toward him, her movements graceful and predatory, like a cat approaching a mouse it intended to play with before killing. Jake kept his breathing steady and his mind calm, knowing that whatever happened next would require all of his courage and all of his strength. And he refused to show fear to this alien ruler who had caused so much death and suffering to his people. The war between humanity and the Volante had been raging for 7 years, and Jake had lost count of how many friends he had buried during that time. And now he found himself face to face with the being responsible for all of that pain. But even as he knelt before her throne in chains, Jake Morgan did not feel defeated, because he knew that his crew had escaped and that the Volante had paid a heavy price for capturing him. And no matter what happened next, he had done his duty. The queen stopped directly in front of him and tilted her head in a gesture that seemed almost curious, and Jake waited to hear what she would say, ready to face whatever came next with the dignity and courage that every human soldier was taught to carry with them into battle. He was afraid, but he would not let her see it, and that small act of defiance was all he had left to give. Queen Seraphi had ruled the Volante Empire for 300 years and had conquered more worlds than she could easily count. But she had never seen a creature quite like the one kneeling before her throne. The human was small compared to her people, fragile looking in his damaged armor. And yet something about the way he held himself suggested a strength that had nothing to do with physical size or power. She circled him slowly, studying every detail of his form, noting the burns on his suit and the place where plasma had torn through his shoulder. And she marveled that such a weak creature had managed to destroy 3 of her warships before being captured. "You are Commander Jake Morgan," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. "And I have heard many stories about you during this war." The human did not respond, and his silence interested her more than any words could have, because most prisoners begged or threatened or wept when brought before her. But this one simply waited. "Your vessel was outnumbered 6-1, she continued. "And yet you chose to fight rather than surrender. And then you stayed behind alone so that your crew could escape, sacrificing yourself for beings who were not even your family or your mates." She paused in front of him and leaned down slightly to look at his helmet, seeing only her own reflection in the dark visor that hid his face. "I confess that I do not understand your species," she admitted. And that is why I had you brought here rather than killed. Because I wish to study you and learn what makes humans so difficult to defeat." The human spoke for the first time. His voice filtered through his helmet, but still carrying a tone of quiet defiance. "You could have asked nicely instead of starting a war." Several of her advisors gasped at the casual way he addressed their queen, and guards stepped forward with weapons raised. But Sci-Fi waved them back with a gesture that contained more curiosity than anger. "You speak to me as though we are equals," she observed. "And I cannot decide if you are very brave or very stupid. Maybe both," the human replied. "But I have always believed that respect should be earned rather than demanded." Sci-Fi felt something stir inside her that she had not experienced in many centuries, and it took her a moment to recognize it as genuine interest in another being. Because most creatures she encountered were too afraid of her to be anything other than boring. "I have studied your kind extensively," she told him, "and I know that your species lives for less than a century on average, that your bodies are fragile and easily broken, that your technology is primitive compared to ours, and yet you have resisted my empire longer than any other civilization in the history of our conquests." She stood tall and spread her arms to indicate the vast throne room surrounding them, with its pillars of living light and its walls that sang with ancient power. "My people have existed for 10,000 years, she declared, "and we have achieved immortality through our technology, living forever in bodies that never age and never weaken. And we have conquered every species we have ever encountered, because they all eventually submit to our superior power." The human remained silent, and Sci-Fi found herself growing frustrated with his refusal to be impressed by her words. "Your people should have surrendered years ago," she continued, "and every logical analysis suggests that you cannot win this war. Yet you continue to fight and die for a cause that seems hopeless. And I want to know why." "Because we are free," the human said simply. "And we intend to stay that way." Sci-Fi studied him for a long moment, trying to understand the meaning behind his words. And then she made a decision that surprised even herself. "Remove your helmet," she commanded. "I wish to see the face of this defiant creature." The human did not move. "I gave you an order," she said, her voice carrying an edge of warning. "With respect," he replied, and she could hear something almost like amusement in his filtered voice. "I do not take orders from you." The throne room fell absolutely silent, and Sci-Fi felt her advisors and guards staring at her, waiting to see how she would respond to such unprecedented defiance. And she realized that her reaction in this moment would be remembered for a very long time. No one had ever refused a direct command from her, not in 3 centuries of rule. And the experience was so strange that she did not immediately know how to process it. Part of her wanted to have the human killed immediately as punishment for his disrespect. But a larger part of her was fascinated by his courage and wanted to understand where it came from. "You are injured and alone," she pointed out, "surrounded by enemies with no hope of escape. And yet you refuse to obey a simple request. And I must admit that I find your behavior extremely confusing." "That is because you do not understand humans," Jake replied. "And you never will if you keep trying to conquer us instead of talking to us." Sci-Fi turned away from him and walked back toward her throne, her mind working through the problem that this strange creature presented. And she realized that force alone would not reveal what she wanted to know, but she was the queen, and she had given a command, and she could not simply accept his refusal without consequences. "Very well," she said, turning back to face him from the steps of her throne. "If you will not remove your helmet willingly, then my guards will remove it for you." She gestured to her soldiers, and they approached the human with cutting tools designed to breach any material in the known galaxy. And Sci-Fi watched with intense interest as they began to work on the seals of his helmet. The human did not struggle or protest, but simply knelt there accepting what was happening. And his calm acceptance was somehow more unsettling than any amount of fighting or screaming would have been. The scent. Guards worked carefully for several minutes, and Sci-Fi found herself holding her breath without realizing it. And she could feel the anticipation building throughout the throne room as everyone waited to see what lay beneath the helmet. Finally, the seals broke, and the guards pulled the helmet away. And Sci-Fi found herself looking into the face of her enemy for the first time. What? She saw it would change everything she thought she knew about humanity and about herself. Queen Sci-Fi had expected many things when the helmet came off. Perhaps rage or terror or hatred or despair. But what she saw in the human's face was none of these things. And the shock of it made her take an involuntary step backward. Jake Morgan looked up at her with tired brown eyes set in a face that told the story of a hard life. And a jagged scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, while burns marked the side of his neck. And his dark hair was wet with sweat and matted against his forehead. But none of these physical details were what made the queen freeze in place. Because what truly shook her was the expression in his eyes and the set of his jaw and the quiet calm that radiated. From every part of his being, there was no fear in his face. She had conquered 100 worlds and had seen countless prisoners brought before her throne. And every single one of them had shown fear when they looked upon her, because fear was the natural response to power and death and the unknown. But this human looked at her the way one might look at a storm approaching on the horizon, something to be acknowledged and weathered, but not something to be terrified of. And his calm acceptance of his situation was deeply unsettling in a way she could not immediately explain. "You do not fear me," she breathed, and her voice came out softer than she intended. "No," Jake agreed simply. "You do not fear death?" The human considered the question for a moment, his eyes never leaving hers, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "I have seen death many times," he told her, "and I have held the hands of friends as they pass from this life to whatever comes next. And I have buried more people than I can count during the years of this war." He paused and shifted slightly on his knees. And Sci-Fi noticed that despite his wounds and his chains, he carried himself with a dignity that she had rarely seen in any being. "Death does not scare me anymore," he continued, "because I have made peace with it, and I know that when my time comes, I will face it the same way I have faced everything else in my life." The queen descended the remaining steps of her throne until she stood directly before him, close enough to see every detail of his weathered face. And she searched his eyes for any sign of deception or false courage, but found only truth. "Then what do you fear?" she asked, and she was surprised to find that she genuinely wanted to know the answer. Jake met her gaze without flinching. "I fear failing the people who depend on me. And I fear living without purpose or meaning. And I fear becoming something that I would not recognize if I looked in a mirror." He glanced around the throne room at the guards and advisors who watched in stunned silence. And then he looked back at the queen. "You could kill me right now," he said, "and I would die knowing that I did everything I could to protect my crew and serve my people. And there is peace in that knowledge. A peace that cannot be taken from me by threats or torture or death." Sci-Fi stared at him for a long moment, and she felt something shifting inside her mind. Some fundamental assumption about the universe being challenged and found wanting. The Lanthi had achieved immortality 3,000 years ago through technology that allowed them to transfer their consciousness from body to body, never aging, never truly dying. And this achievement had been the foundation of their entire civilization. They had conquered other species because they believed that their immortality made them superior. That beings who lived forever were naturally more valuable than beings who died. And this belief had justified everything they had done. But standing before this fragile human who would live less than a century, even if she released him today, Sci-Fi realized that immortality had cost her people something precious. The Volanti feared death above all things because they had arranged their entire existence around avoiding it. And this fear had made them aggressive and cruel and desperate to control everything around them. Yet here was a creature who had accepted his own mortality and had found freedom in that acceptance. And his peace was something that all the power and technology of her empire could not provide. "What are you?" she whispered, and the question carried more weight than she had intended. "I am just a man," Jake replied. "Nothing special, nothing extraordinary. Just a human being trying to do the right thing in a universe that does not always make it easy." The queen turned away from him and walked a few steps toward her throne, her mind racing with thoughts and questions that she had never considered before. 300 years I have ruled this empire," she said quietly, speaking as much to herself as to him. "And I have believed that strength meant power, that victory meant conquest, that immortality meant superiority." She turned back to face him, and her expression had changed from curiosity to something that looked almost like confusion. "But you have shown me something different," she continued. "A strength that comes from acceptance rather than control. A victory that has nothing to do with armies or weapons. A kind of immortality that exists in purpose rather than in endless years." Jake watched her carefully, uncertain of where this conversation was leading, but aware that something important was happening in this moment. "My people live forever," the queen said. "And yet most of them have forgotten what it means to truly live, because when you have unlimited time, nothing feels urgent or precious or meaningful anymore." She gestured at the vast throne room around them, at the symbols of power and conquest that decorated every surface. "I have spent 3 centuries accumulating power and territory and influence," she admitted. "And I have told myself that these things proved my worth and justified my existence. But looking into your eyes, I see something that I lost long ago and had forgotten even existed." "What is that?" Jake asked. The queen was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Purpose," she said. "True purpose that gives meaning to each day and each choice. Purpose that makes even death acceptable because it serves something larger than yourself." She looked at Jake with an expression that held wonder and sorrow in equal measure. "You are dying from the moment you are born," she observed. "And yet that knowledge has made you more alive than my people have been in thousands of years." Jake nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his mind about what was really happening in this conversation. "We call it being human," he said simply. The throne room remained silent as Queen Seraphie and Jake Morgan looked at each other across a gap that was far larger than the physical distance between them. And in that silence, something was changing that neither of them fully understood yet. "Tell me more," the queen said finally. And it was not a command but a request, which surprised everyone present, including herself. "Tell me about your people and why you fight, and what gives you the strength to face death without fear." Jake shifted on his knees and felt the ache in his wounded shoulder. But he pushed the pain aside, because he sensed that this conversation might be more important than any battle he had ever fought. "Humans have been fighting since before we left our home planet," he began. "And we have faced extinction more times than I can count. From ice ages and plagues and wars and disasters that should have wiped us out completely." He looked around at the beautiful alien architecture surrounding them, at the technology that seemed like magic to his human eyes. "We do not have immortality," he continued, "and our bodies are fragile compared to yours, and our technology is primitive. And by every measure that you use to judge worth, we should be insignificant." The queen nodded, because everything he said matched what her scientists and strategists had told her about humanity. "But none of that matters," Jake said, and his voice grew stronger as he spoke, "because we have something that cannot be measured or conquered or taken away. And that is our choice to keep fighting no matter what. He met her eyes directly, and the Queen found herself leaning forward slightly to hear his words. "Every human knows that they will die," Jake explained. "And this knowledge could break us, could make us give up and surrender to despair. But instead, we have chosen to make our brief lives mean something." He gestured with his bound hands toward the guards who had captured him. "Your soldiers took me prisoner because I stayed behind to let my crew escape," he said. "And I did that not because I wanted to die, but because I wanted their lives to continue. Wanted the things they would do, and the children they would have, and the futures they would build." The Queen tilted her head, trying to understand this way of thinking that was so different from her own. "You sacrificed yourself for others," she observed, "but you gained nothing from it. And now you are here in chains while they are free." "I gained everything that matters," Jake replied, "because I know that my choice meant something, that my life had purpose. That when I die, I will have left the universe slightly better than I found it." Queen Seraphi turned to her advisors, who had been listening in stunned silence throughout this exchange. "Admiral Karth," she said, addressing an elderly Valanthi in ceremonial armor, "in 7 years of war, how many humans have we captured alive?" The Admiral consulted his records before answering. 47, Your Majesty." "And how many of those surrendered willingly?" There was a pause before the Admiral replied, "None, Your Majesty. All of them were taken unconscious or too badly wounded to continue fighting." The Queen nodded, as if this confirmed something she had suspected. "And how many human prisoners have we successfully converted to our cause? How many have agreed to work for us in exchange for their lives?" This time, the silence stretched even longer before the Admiral spoke. "None, Your Majesty. We have offered wealth and power and immortality to human prisoners, and every single one of them has refused. Most chose death rather than betray their people." Jake watched this exchange with quiet interest, understanding that the Queen was making a point not just to herself, but to her entire court. "Do you understand now?" the Queen asked her advisors, and her voice carried a weight that silenced any potential response. "We have been fighting a species that cannot be conquered because they do not value the things we offer." She turned back to Jake with an expression that held something almost like respect. "Your people do not fear death," she said slowly, "and so they cannot be threatened, and your people value loyalty and purpose over survival. And so they cannot be bribed, and your people find meaning in sacrifice. And so they cannot be broken." Jake nodded. "That is what it means to be human." The Queen walked in a slow circle around him, her silver form reflecting the light of the throne room as she processed everything she had learned. "My people achieved immortality because we feared death more than anything else," she admitted. "And for 3,000 years, we have been running from the end that all living things must eventually face, building an empire to distract ourselves from the truth we did not want to accept." She stopped in front of Jake and looked down at his scarred, weathered face. "But you face that truth every day," she said, "and instead of being destroyed by it, you have found a way to make it give your lives meaning and purpose." "We had to," Jake replied, "because the alternative was despair, and humans have never been very good at giving up." The Queen was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was different, softer and more thoughtful than before. "I have lived for 300 years, she said, "and in all that time I have never met anyone who challenged my understanding of the universe as much as you have in the last hour." She looked at her advisors and guards, at the symbols of power that surrounded her throne, at the empire she had built through conquest and fear. "I thought I knew what strength meant," she admitted. "But I was wrong." Jake watched her carefully, sensing that something important was about to happen. And he waited to see what the most powerful being in the known galaxy would do with the truth he had shared. The Queen made her decision, and it would change everything. Queen Seraphis sat upon her throne for 3 days after Jake Morgan was returned to his cell, refusing food and visitors and spending her time in deep thought about everything she had learned from the strange human prisoner. Advisors grew worried as hours turned into days, because they had never seen their queen so affected by anything, and they whispered among themselves about what might be happening inside her mind, but Seraphivled or confused. She was simply processing a truth that had shaken the foundations of everything she believed about herself and her empire, and the meaning of existence. For 300 years she had conquered worlds and accumulated power, telling herself that these achievements proved her worth and justified her rule. But the human's words had shown her a different way of measuring value. He had nothing compared to her. No immortality, no empire, no armies or fleets. Yet he possessed something that she realized she had lost long ago, and had been searching for ever since: purpose that made each day meaningful. Courage that came from acceptance rather than denial. Peace that no amount of power could provide. On the 3rd day, she summoned her council and gave orders that shocked everyone who heard them. Bring the human to the throne room, she commanded, and treat him as an honored guest rather than a prisoner. Her advisors exchanged worried glances, but obeyed without question, because the queen's word was absolute law. And soon Jake Morgan was brought before her again. This time he was not in chains. His wounds had been properly treated, his uniform had been cleaned and repaired, and he walked into the throne room freely with guards who escorted rather than restrained him. Jake looked up at the queen with curiosity in his eyes, uncertain what this change in treatment might mean, but hopeful that it signaled something positive. I have thought carefully about everything you told me, Seraphie began, and her voice carried throughout the vast chamber. And I have reached a decision that will change the course of history. She descended from her throne and approached Jake, stopping when she stood directly before him at the same level, rather than looking down from above. I'm going to release you, she announced. Jake blinked in surprise, because this was not among the outcomes he had imagined possible when he first woke up in chains aboard her ship. You and your crew will be returned safely to human space, the queen continued. And I am also ordering an immediate ceasefire along all borders between our peoples. My ambassadors will contact your government to discuss terms for ending this war permanently. The throne room erupted in shocked whispers as advisors and guards struggled to process what they were hearing, because the Volanthi had never offered peace to any species they had fought. Conquest was the only outcome they had ever accepted. Your Majesty. Admiral Korath stepped forward with concern evident in his voice. This is unprecedented. We have never surrendered or negotiated with an enemy. What will the other worlds we have conquered think when they learn of this? Seraphie turned to face her admiral with an expression that silenced any further objection. They will learn that the Volanthi are capable of growth and change, she replied. And that strength does not always mean domination. And that there are some things more valuable than conquest. She looked back at Jake, who was still processing the unexpected turn of events. I looked into your face and saw something that my people lost long ago, she told him. And her voice was quieter now, meant more for him than for the watching court. We became so afraid of death that we forgot how to live. And we have spent 3,000 years running from a truth that you face every single day. Jake found his voice at last. Why are you doing this? The queen smiled, and it was a strange expression on her alien features, something that seemed almost human in its warmth. Because you showed me that true strength comes from acceptance rather than denial, she explained. And because your people have something that all our technology and immortality cannot provide. And I want to learn from you rather than destroy you. She extended a clawed hand toward him, and after a moment of hesitation, Jake reached out and took it in his own. I am not foolish enough to believe that peace will be easy, Seraphie admitted. There is much pain and anger on both sides of this war. And healing will take time and effort from everyone. She squeezed his hand gently, mindful of her greater strength. But I believe it is possible, she continued. And I believe that our two peoples can learn from each other. You can teach us how to find meaning in limited time. And we can share our knowledge and technology to help your people flourish. Jake nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settling around him like a cloak. Understanding that he had somehow become the bridge between two civilizations that have been trying to destroy each other for 7 years. I will carry your message to my people, he promised. And I will tell them what I have seen here today. A queen who was willing to question everything she believed when confronted with a new truth. Seraphony released his hand and stepped back, her expression thoughtful. You called yourself just a man, she recalled. Nothing special, nothing extraordinary. But I think you underestimate yourself, Commander Jake Morgan, she gestured to her guards, who stepped forward with Jake's helmet and personal effects. You changed the mind of an immortal queen with nothing but words and the courage to speak them, she said. And that is more than any army or weapon has ever accomplished against my people. Jake accepted his helmet and looked down at it, remembering the moment when it had been removed and everything had changed. I did not change anything, he said quietly. I simply told you the truth about what it means to be human. And you were wise enough to listen. The queen nodded, accepting his words with grace. Then perhaps that is the lesson we both needed to learn, she replied. That wisdom means being willing to listen, even to those we consider enemies. Even when what they say challenges everything we believe. She turned to address the entire throne room, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast space. Let it be known throughout the Empire, she proclaimed, that the Valanthi seek peace with humanity, and that we wish to learn from these remarkable beings who have shown us a different kind of strength. As Jake was escorted to a transport ship that would carry him home, he looked back at the throne room one final time and saw the queen watching him go. He raised a hand in farewell, and she returned the gesture. And in that simple exchange was contained the hope of two civilizations that had been at war and might now find a way to live in peace. Jake did not know what the future would hold, whether the peace would last or whether old hatreds would eventually destroy what had been built in this moment. But he knew that humanity had done what it always did, had faced the impossible and refused to kneel, and in doing so, it had changed everything. The stars waited outside the transport's windows as Jake began the journey home, carrying with him a message of hope and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting but from simply being willing to show someone who you really are. And as the ship jumped into faster than light travel, Jake Morgan smiled, because he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, humanity would face them the same way it always had, together, unafraid, and determined to make each brief, precious life mean something. The end.